William F. Buckley Jr. and Staughton Lynd. Tonight, Vietnam. What next?
That I believe that the course that the United States should now follow in that country is withdrawal. And I feel that because I think, in fact, what we have done is to read the situation in Southeast Asia as if it were a military invasion, like those of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, or indeed like those of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe after World War II, whereas I am inclined to think that it's essentially a civil war rather than military aggression from without.
I was slow to become aware of the war in Vietnam, and my first forceful encounter with it was when I was in Mississippi in the summer of 1964.
Let us take a brief look at the context of Staughton's awakening to the reality of the Vietnam War, an awakening which would launch him into active resistance to the war and which would have serious negative consequences for his career in academia. Staughton Lynd first became concerned about the Vietnam War in the summer of 1964 while he was serving as coordinator of freedom schools in Mississippi, a movement which not only helped young African Americans to improve their basic academic skills, but also help them to think critically about history, politics, and their own social reality. Freedom schools, along with a drive to help African Americans to become registered voters, were part of Freedom Summer.
The Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, was where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. It is now the site of the National Civil Rights Museum, which includes an exhibit about the Freedom Schools and mentions their director in Mississippi, Dr. Staughton Lynd.
The Mount Zion United Methodist Church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, decided to host a freedom school. On June 16th, the Ku Klux Klan attacked the church, beating church members and burning down the building. Civil rights workers Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman went to Philadelphia to look for alternative sites for a freedom school. Stopped for supposedly speeding by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, they were held in jail until the Klan had their ambush ready. Released, they drove off, but Price stopped them again and turned them over to the Klan. The three were savagely beaten, shot to death, and buried in an earthen dam. The bodies were found in early August. On their way to a meeting in Meridian, Staughton and others stopped in Philadelphia for an informal memorial service at the site of the burned church.
After the three young men who had been killed by Ku Klux Klansmen, after their bodies were discovered, there was an impromptu memorial service at a ruined church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where they were killed. Now, the church was ruined because it had been asked of the deacons that they make it available for a freedom school. And you have to understand that any of these black churches were built brick by brick, dollar by dollar over a period of time. So the deacons finally said yes, and shortly afterwards the church was destroyed with a bomb. So on our way to Meridian, Mississippi, near the Alabama border where the official memorial service occurred that evening, we stopped off in Philadelphia. And I have a mental picture of Bob Moses standing down a slope, gradual slope from where the rest of us were. And my goodness, you would have expected him to talk about the deaths of the three and the failure of the federal government to provide protection. And he did, but he did it by saying, you know what happened this week? Congress passed something called the Tonkin Bay Resolution.
This resolution authorized the Johnson administration to escalate U.S. military involvement in Southeast Asia, but later it became clear that the administration had misled Congress by presenting an inaccurate version of a naval incident which had occurred in the Tonkin Gulf off the coast of Vietnam.
About 25,000 people attended. There were a couple of congresspersons there. I remember talking about a young Vietnamese man who had been captured by American troops. And then there was a scene that reminded me of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, where this young man was stood up against a tree or whatever and just shot down by American soldiers. No no trial, no opportunity for him to explain why he felt so deeply about this. We just killed him like a mad dog in the street. The situation was summer of 1965, the war is rapidly escalating, and I thought it was essential that a few of us at least take action over the summer to keep consciousness alive about what was going on in Vietnam. I, with other close friends who were also movement leaders, Bob Moses, David Dellinger, led a column of a couple of hundred people from the Washington Monument toward the steps of the Capitol with the idea that other people, maybe even a government, were at war with the people of Vietnam, but we were not. I'm sorry we didn't make, we were arrested before we got to the steps, because I think that's a very powerful way of thinking about selective conscientious objection. You, Joe Mulligan, may be a citizen of some other country. I don't know you very well, but I don't want to kill you. And I am letting it be known that I'm not going to do it if I can possibly avoid it. And so, in that way, there was a parallelism between Alice taking her first steps in the direction of draft counseling, and I, during that same year, 1965, when my goodness, things escalated so rapidly. Also searching for ways that I could put my body in the way of what was going on. Something very affecting me was that there was a man named Norman Morrison who was in his 30s. He was a Quaker, as Alice and I had become. Norman was the clerk, the administrative officer of a Quaker meeting in Baltimore. Happened to be the Quaker meeting where Alice and I were married. And the people responsible for the meeting, he told me this, said to him, now, you're representing an entire meeting of people who have different feelings about the war. Don't put yourself out there too prominently. So when the rest of us were marching down the mall to declare peace, he wasn't doing that because to keep his job, he had been instructed not to. And I often thought later, that's a dangerous situation when a person is drawn by conscience to take, let's say, a stand of intermediate risk and exposure, and is not permitted to do it. He may see no alternative but to do something more. And so in the first week of November, Norman read in a little publication, I.F. Stone's Weekly, the experience of a priest in Vietnam who had a school of young children which was bombed by the United States. For Norman, it was apparently, I guess the cliche is the last straw. It pushed him over the edge. He did something very precipitous. He left a note for his wife, which said a little inarticulately, I'm doing this for the priest and his children. He took their baby, less than a year old, because it was his task at the moment to care for her. He took a car, the car he was using, which happened to belong to Alice's parents. He drove to the Pentagon. He found a location under the window where Secretary of Defense McNamara had his office. He poured the gasoline or kerosene over himself, carefully put the baby, Emily, several feet away so she would not be harmed, and burned himself to death. I found myself not long after, 6 weeks after, on my way to North Vietnam with Herbert Apteker, an American communist who had been invited to take 2 non-communists and come to North Vietnam. And I was the first non-communist, and the second was my friend Tom Hayden, who was a leader for Students for a Democratic Society.
Our purpose in going, mine at least, was to try to clarify, if we could, the approach to peace negotiations from the standpoint of the other side. Because there were, and I learned after coming back, this confusion exists in our government as well. There were a series of questions, such as, what do they mean when they say, settle the affairs of South Vietnam according to the program of the National Liberation Front? Do they, in fact, require the physical withdrawal of all American troops before negotiations? There were a series of such questions that seemed to me, and I think to many others in this country, unclear. And my own personal way of dealing with the anguish which I'm sure we all have about the war was to feel that as a historian, perhaps I could help somewhat in clarifying some of these issues.
Firing line with William F. Buckley Jr. and Staughton Lynd.
It's very hard to know when you take an extreme action whether it did any good, because so often the causes and effects are beyond our consciousness. The three of us, Apteker, Hayden, and I, went to Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, Moscow. And in Moscow, on our way to Vietnam, hadn't gotten there yet, we met a man whom I believe was not a representative of the North Vietnamese government, but of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the guerrilla movement within the southern portion of that country. He was very frail. I wanted to say, don't open the window or it might blow you out. He was an old man and had spent decades in prison during the time that the Vietnamese were fighting the French for their national independence. He read me like a book. He said, Professor, you don't understand. We're going to win this war. He said, you have two choices. Either, please, leave my country alone and we can stop fighting each other. But if you make the opposite choice, and that was the choice that the United States government was busily making of escalating more troops, for every American soldier that lands in my country, one more person is going to come to the national liberation. The second experience that I carried back from Vietnam was the following. My two friends and I were taken to visit a factory. And there were photographs on the pillars that held up the factory ceiling. Some of those photographs were of demonstrations that I had been part of in the United States, and I was feeling a little puffed up that even on the other side of the world, our little anti-war movement was recognized. And we were then taken after our tour of the factory floor into a little side room, and the factory manager spoke with us. And I had, in the course of my half-lived life, encountered, many social scientists, Marxists, whoever, claimed to be able to predict the future and were characteristically dead wrong. This man was correct. And he said that as opponents of American imperialism, in my experience, characteristically say, we don't hate the American people. We admire the American people. It's your government that concerns us. And by way of illustrating it, he said, we applaud your Declaration of Independence written by Abraham Lincoln. And I sat there feeling, come on, brother, that's pretty basic fact, get it right. And then I realized I didn't know as much about his country as the little that he knew about mine, even though he connected a couple of things wrongly. Along about then, he was saying, he said, we admire America we feel affection for it. But just now, the word America has become difficult for us to say. Pause. Silencio. I'm sitting there fiddling with the little candies, waiting for one more welcoming speech to conclude. And finally, I look up and he's weeping. And just as I had to be taught by my enemy that was going to be as easy to win this war as I imagined, I had to be taught that so-called Oriental inscrutability is nonsense. That human beings are basically alike, and all over the world, mothers weep for what happens to their children, and all over the world, young men go forth, rightly or wrongly, trying to find a way to protect their parents and uphold the honor of their community. And I think it has left me feeling that I'm with Tom Paine, who said in his book, The Rights of Man, I am a citizen of the world, and my country is all mankind. And those are easy words to say and very, 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 very demanding words to live up to.
Be honest. It is not the absence of democracy that offends our governing class. It is interference with private capital, which that class considers the indispensable precondition for democracy. Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, Aristide in Haiti were all democratically elected. But to one degree or another, each had taken into public control resources desired by United States corporations. The United States government, therefore, overthrew them. In Vietnam, there was not very much to be either nationalized or privatized. But Vietnam was wrongly believed to be a client state of Communist China, and Ho Chi Minh was rightly believed likely to win any free election. And so, as President Eisenhower confessed in his memoirs, the United States deliberately sabotaged the nationwide democratic election planned at the 1954 Geneva Conference.
In 1967 or 66, really, I got involved in draft counseling, and that was partly because Yale students would come to the house and want to talk with Staughton about what they should do about the war. And the end of one evening, I said, Staughton, we know some people who refused to participate in war in earlier years or refused to register or went to jail and so forth. You should write a book about them. And he said, why me? So I ended up, was the first kind of written work that I had ever done, put together a book of personal accounts of war objectors with a whole wide range of grounds and of what they did, with the idea that people who were trying to grapple with these questions needed to know what other people had done, not to necessarily follow those, but to be stimulated in their own mind. Well, I wouldn't do that, but I might do this.